Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Planning Skills webinar with SNH on Habitats Regulations Appraisal and Natura. This is part of SNH capacity training that's been carried out over the past year or so with several authorities. We're just aware that not everyone has a chance to experience this yet, and we're covering a few of the topics via webinar just due to the COVID restrictions. My name is Trevor Moffat and I'm from the Improvement Service. I'm joined today from SNH by Crispin Hill and Christodoulou-Davies. Our format for today will be a presentation from SNH by Crispin, which will last about 40 minutes or so. This will be followed by about 20 minutes of Q&A. Thanks to everyone who's sent questions in already. We'll try to answer those. But if anyone has anything they wish to ask during the presentation, you should have an option of a questions box on the right-hand side of your screen. Please just type in any questions there, and we'll pick them up during the Q&A section at the end as well. If you have any technical difficulties at all, please just use that question box, and I will try to address them as best I can. I will now pass over to Crispin, and we will minimise our webcams so you can see his slides in full. Over to you, Crispin.
Thank you, Trevor. Okay, hopefully that's done what it needs to do. Yeah, thank you for that. My name's Crispin Hill, as you know. Until very recently, I was a Natura operations officer in SNH. I've recently changed roles to be an area officer now across southern Scotland and Forth areas. So I do a lot of work around Dumfries and Galloway and the borders and around the Lothians. Now, we only have 40 minutes, and in SNH, this takes about a day to get through. So we don't have time to get into every detail of this process. What I've tried to do is pick out the key issues and the aspects that I want to focus on and try and tease out what certain phrases mean, what certain concepts mean, and how you work your way in sort of practical sense through the process. So we're going to move on to the slides. Okay, this is the brief sort of summary. Briefly going to talk about information sources, then who has to do what, who has what responsibilities, and then we're going to dive into the actual process itself. Before we get into that though, I've got to bring up this first slide, the precautionary principle. It's a really important underlying philosophy within the Habitats Directive, underpins the entire process. You're hopefully all reasonably familiar with what that means, but I put up a quote for those of you who aren't entirely sure. It really means the burden of proof that something, in this case a plan or a project, is not going to be harmful, and in this case to the environment, falls upon those taking that action. So there needs to be proof of the negative. There are limits to the level of precaution involved in the HRA process, but it's a really important first point to try and make and to keep in the back of your mind as we work through this. Okay, on to sources of information. First of all, I'd recommend SiteLink. Again, some of you may be pretty familiar with this. It's an SNH series of databases which can give you all sorts of information. Here's an example, SPA, and you can pick out all sorts of details here. The map, the conservation objectives, that's something I'm going to mention many times this morning. The citation and the condition of the site and that kind of thing. So a really useful first point of call for anybody who wants to go there. There's also, of course, our website, and there's all sorts of pages on HRA there. In particular, I think there's 3 or 4 which I think are very useful. You can see on the right-hand side the one called Help and Advice, and that's absolutely full of bits of guidance. I know, we're all probably up to our eyeballs in guidance, but there are some good ones in there. I think our own, the second one down there, our own Natura casework guidance, which has recently been published, is written for SNH officers, but has a lot of good practical help in there. The top one you see is all to do with this recent People Over Wind case, which has caused a few ripples. And there's also an HRA plans one there, just over halfway down the page. So if you're looking for some kind of guidance and you can't get it from a person, I recommend that help and advice page on our own website. Now, I know we have both people who are involved in development plans and development management today. So I've included a few slides to do with plans. And probably the main point to make is that actually the tests are the same thing for plans and projects. There are differences, and I bring up one there. Plans are often less certain in their delivery than projects. However, as I've just said, the HRA structure and the test always remain the same. There's become a bit of a sort of a slide towards program HRAs and plan HRAs and project HRAs and strategic HRAs. And there may be tweaks between them, but they're actually, you're addressing exactly the same tests in each of those types of HRAs. So it's probably not worth trying to create too much clear water between these different kinds of HRAs. And of course, the precautionary principle, as I've said, it underlies the whole thing. So it's in there for all sorts of plans and projects HRA. What I would recommend at the start of any kind of plan-related HRA is early engagement. It's always helpful to talk to SNH if you need to get some help early. Don't try and wait for the policies to be finalised. That way lies heartache for all of us involved and that kind of thing. Come to us early and we can try and help maybe tweak things or work your way through things or find mitigation for things to get you through the HRA process. I would flag up that the screening stage, if you're familiar with that term, is often, well, almost always the most time-consuming element of any HRA of a plan. And I want to bring that up in case you find yourself getting exasperated with it when your time comes. The appropriate assessment in relation is normally pretty short and snappy. And in combination, if you're dealing with a plan, it often covers a fairly large strategic spatial area, and something like an in-combination effect is often quite possible. So just to be aware of that element of the process. Okay, responsibilities. Who does what and why do they do it? Competent authority, that's one of the few phrases in the directives or the regulations which is actually fairly well explained and includes all those bullet points below. It's pretty much any kind of public body of any description. That fourth bullet point kind of summarizes the whole thing really in its entirety. It also involves some bodies which may not be immediately obvious as public bodies, but also which have public duties. In Scotland, SSE has a few duties in that sense. I wouldn't be surprised if CalMac Ferries has something similar as well. So there are also other bodies, not just public bodies, which have become competent authorities. This is kind of why planning authorities have to do HRAs. That top regulation is called regulation, the general duty, regulation 3.3. You can all read it for yourself. I've tried to underline what I think are kind of the important points in a lot of these quotes that I'm going to bring up over the next 20 slides or so. And for me, in that first quote, it's the very small words which are important. So every competent authority in any of their functions shall have regard. So there's very little wiggle room in there. Regulation 48, this is the basis of HRA itself. And again, a kind of key point for me is that competent authority has to do this before they give consent to a plan or a project. And we'll go into that, the details of more of Regulation 48 over the course of this presentation. Applicants have a role in all this. Their job is to provide the information to the competent authority to allow the competent authority to do their job. And it's written into the regulations again. This is an important quote, I think. It came up in European guidance and it was emboldened in the original guidance, which is pretty rare for European guidance to do any kind of highlighting of text. But it essentially points out that it's often the developers and the consultants that cause the problems within HRA by not providing the quality or quantity of data that the competent authority needs to make a proper judgment, whether that's at the LSE stage, a screening stage, or whether it's in the appropriate assessment. So that's why it's also a good idea for, again, communication to happen very early on. We want everybody to be on the same page as to what needs to be acquired data-wise in order to pass the pretty rigorous tests that are in the HRA process. SNH have roles as well. The one you'll be most familiar with is a statutory consultee, where we're legally required to be consulted at the appropriate assessment stage, and I believe we're legally required to then provide advice back to the competent authority. We also have a secondary role, like yourselves, as a competent authority. That's for certain aspects of our work, such as NNR management plans and SSI consents and that kind of thing. The idea is that the competent authority must have regard to SNH's advice. That's what's written into the regulations. That's, again, a legal phrase which has been clarified through case law. And I've put in a quote from a case law in England called Whiteling, which is to do with Whiteling ferries between the mainland and the Isle of Wight. And in that, the judge said the statutory nature conservation body's advice, or SNH's advice, carries considerable weight within the HRA. and the competent authority should have cogent and compelling reasons if disagreeing with that advice. And that's really important, because if there's a disagreement, there's a lack of certainty, and certainty is a phrase I'm going to be bringing up later on as well. So keep that in mind when it comes to later on in the process here. Jargon is one other point to make briefly. You're all probably familiar with jargon. HRA is particularly notorious for it, I think. There's often a danger, I think, in the HRA process where the people who do the environmental assessments, whether it's consultants or in a local authority, tend to get the HRAs as well as the EIAs and sometimes even the SEAs. And it's really quite problematic, because although the language and the phraseology is very similar, almost exactly the same in a lot of ways between those different processes, in HRA, some of those phrases, as I pointed out on the slide, mean radically different things. And so it can be a real head wrecker if you're the person who's been just dumped with the EIA and the HRA to read through, and you're trying to work out what likely means in the one and what likely means in the other, and the same with the significant, which is that kind of crucial threshold in an EIA. So just be wary of that if you're given both these things to do. And also be aware that EIA and SEA are not as rigorous as HRA. And again, this is why we're probably here today, is to try and work our way through the rigors of the process. There's a few kind of tips and tricks on this slide to maybe take away with you as well as later on when you're confronted with this kind of thing. Okay, the procedure. I'm going to go through a few key points, I think, in this process, and then talk about case law interpretations. So for us in SNH, this is our 3-stage process that we go through. I've seen different ways of slicing this, but this is what we do. This is the first test, which you guys don't need to worry about, and I've grayed out because this is really more for sort of SNH officers who might be dealing with an RSPB or a Scottish Wildlife Trust nature reserve, and they're dealing with something like that. For planners, this is really your first question you have to ask yourself. This is the first part of the process. Is what you're looking at likely to have a significant effect, that's an LSE, on a European site, a Natura site, alone or in combination? And then the third test is basically the appropriate assessment question. Can you determine that the proposal will not have an adverse effect on site integrity? So, likely significant effect, that sounds simple enough, but there's an awful lot of partial and misunderstandings of this stage. And I often spend a lot more time talking about LSE and screening than I do about appropriate assessments. It's a pretty messy stage if you don't know what you're doing. And in essence, it's really a pretty simple check, a precautionary check of the impacts of the plan or the project you're looking at against whatever Natura site you have concerns about. That's what it's really down to. It's really just a very simple process, a coarse filter. It shouldn't be a proxy appropriate assessment. It shouldn't need lots of loads of data. And the purpose of it is to simply weed out those unconnected proposals from any further work, so any appropriate assessment. We'll get back into it, don't worry. A few points to remember before we kind of really dive into it. The full test, as you might have seen on an earlier slide, is alone or in combination. That's important to remember. Second of all, plans and projects outside the site often need considering, because you can have things like run-of-the-river hydro schemes, which can be way upstream of an SAC river or an SAC wetland, sorry. Or you can have wind turbines, 10 kilometers away from a goose roost, but they can still have effects on the features of those sites. So don't be hidebound by boundaries, especially when it comes to SPAs and birds that move around a lot. Another point to remember is always record your decisions. I'm always telling this to even to SNH staff. Provide your rationale for why you think what you think, even if that's just one sentence. In fact, it's great if it's one sentence. Provide your reasoning for all your decisions, even the noddy stuff. The fourth point, conservation objectives. Again, there's something I'm going to talk about a lot. They're really helpful for a site-by-site approach. They can help you try and make decisions as to what kind of effects might be had on your site, and I'll explain that more as we go along. And as I've already briefly mentioned, there's no legal requirement to consult SNH at this stage. Okay, so really get into the nuts and bolts of what likely significant effect really means. How you try and understand what that phrase means. Now, case law is really important in Natura because the directive and the regulations can be a bit vaguely worded, and there's been masses of case law over 25 years or so, which has clarified and reinterpreted phrases concepts to try and move things on and come to decisions within that case. But we can take a certain amount from those to extrapolate out. So this is kind of the granddaddy of all Natura cases, what we call the Wadensee case from the early noughties. And they said, likely and significant in a normal everyday understanding sounds like there's got to be a certain degree of probability about something before you decide it is likely and significant. And the Wadensee case said, no. The way you think about this is if it cannot be excluded on the basis of some information that it will have a significant effect, it will have a significant effect. So that's much more precautionary than our normal understanding of what likely and significant really means. So that's the first shot across the bow for where we're going with this kind of part of the process. Much more precautionary. And it also referred back to the conservation objectives. So if the plan or project, if the impacts of that plan or project are likely to undermine or have some kind of negative impact on the site's conservation objectives, then it must be considered likely to have a significant effect. So again, so that's why I said the conservation objectives are kind of useful yardsticks for you. There's another case called the Sweetman case, much more recently from about 2013, 2014. It's a case in Ireland to do with the Galway bypass. And in that, the judge in this case said made several interesting points. And this is what I've tried to boil it down to, this first test. They basically said the English version lost something in translation. It says that the other languages set their test, which we translate as likely and significant, to be something much more precautionary. And that second quote there kind of really clarifies that for you. Each of those versions, those other language versions, so Spanish and German and French and Dutch, suggest that the test is set at a lower level. And the question is simply whether the plan or project is capable of having an effect. So again, in line with the Wadensee judgment, much more precautionary than we generally understand likely or significant to be. The Sweetman case continues. That it should be a relatively simple decision. It's not something you should be acquiring lots of data for. So it says the possibility of there being a significant effect on the site will generate the need for an appropriate assessment. There is no need to establish such an effect. You don't have to prove there's an effect. You just need to have the possibility or the risk of an effect. And it's the same with a kind of Bagmore quote, which is a more domestic piece of legislation, case law below. Again, kind of pointing out that really it's a pretty simple, light touch approach at the LSE stage, which then takes you on to the appropriate assessment. So it's just, this stage, the way I think of it, it's just a precautionary check or trigger to determine if an appropriate assessment is needed. Okay, so the summary of the LSE stage. Because it's just this initial check or trigger, deciding as a likely and significant effect is not some kind of disaster. Again, if you're more familiar with EIA or even SEA, if you find yourself writing the word significant, you sometimes have the collie wobbles because you know this means something's now going to be important. In HRA, that's not the case. It's just a matter of, okay, we now have to check into something a little bit more detail. So it should be simple, precautionary decision. If you decide there's no likely significant effect, so there's no connection between your plan or project and a Natura site, you stop your process, you provide your rationale and you stop. If you decide there is a likely significant effect, you carry on the appropriate assessment stage. And as I mentioned, the conservation objectives are there. They're kind of your yardsticks to try and help you measure impacts against. And I know I haven't presented those yet, but they're coming quite soon, so we'll hopefully get a better understanding of what they mean. And I've crossed out the fifth point intentionally because until this people over wind case, which some of you may have heard of, came along, it seemed okay to those people who dealt with this kind of thing that certain mitigation measures, only certain ones, could be used to help you remove the likelihood or the significance of an effect on a Natura site, and that's now changed. So I'm going to discuss that briefly next. So mitigation at the likely significant effect stage. As I said, there was a time when we could do this, but this case came along in 2018, so fairly recently, and said, actually, it's not appropriate at the screening stage to take account of the measures intended to avoid or reduce the harmful effects of the plan or project on that Natura site. And that sort of set a lot of ripples going through the industry, and people tried to work out what it meant. And we've worked through this process over sort of 2018 into early 2019. There's guidance on the SNH website, but the idea is now that if you are putting mitigation in place because of the Natura site, and I'm simplifying things slightly here, but that's unavoidable, but you can read it more fully in the guidance. But if you're putting things in place because the Natura site might otherwise be affected, that's the kind of mitigation you can't use at the screening stage. You must take that mitigation through to an appropriate assessment and check whether it does what it should do, and be tested through that appropriate assessment sort of rigor instead. If that mitigation would have been in place, no matter whether a Natura site was anywhere near or not, if it's something you just do as a matter of course, then that is much more likely to be acceptable at this stage in the HRA process. I say I can't get into that in too much detail given the time we've got, but I'm sure there'll be a question or two about that as we move forward. You'll also remember I mentioned in combination once or twice earlier on. And in combination is an important part of any HRA because, as I flagged up in the first bullet here, combinations of many small effects can be just as damaging as one big kind of classic effect you might see from something like a major project of some sort. So the directive kind of realised this and sort of required this in combination element of the screening stage to be undertaken. I won't get into too much detail. Again, there's guidance available, but again, I can answer questions on it. But given the time we've got, I'm going to move on from this, but I just want to highlight that it exists. Okay, so HRA plans are going to come back to the plans stage. Plans are slightly different creatures to projects, as we've mentioned. And to help you through that, I've taken a boxed bit of text from the HRA plans guidance to kind of show you how there's a slightly different way of dealing with things in plans to help you through that, the difference between dealing with between a plan and a project. So you've got three some mini steps within the screening stage to try and help you deal with those multiplicity of aspects you often have in a fairly large plan. You can have hundreds of different aspects to be trying to deal with. So there's kind of these three mini steps to help you screen things out and only focus on the things that really count. Okay, we'll move on to the appropriate assessment stage. Now, that's the final test down there, number 3. Can we decide that the plan of the project will not have an adverse effect on site integrity? So that's the latest acronym. That's the phraseology that we're going to get into. So for plans, the same test applies. That quote kind of sets that out. It is for the plan making body to ascertain that the implementation of the plan will not adversely affect the integrity of a European site. It's the same process, really, at least in its bones. Okay, there's certain legal obligations that come from this because this is all set down in law. There's a logical flow to that, I think. So we move on from the likely significant effect stage in the first quote. So any plan or project likely to have a significant effect shall be subject to an appropriate assessment in view of the site's conservation objectives. That's actually written in to the regulations, to the law itself. So if you don't use the conservation objectives, at least at the appropriate assessment stage, your assessment cannot be considered to be appropriate. Okay. The competent authority's responsibility. You can see in the second quote, the competent authority need to be convinced or certain that the plan of the project will not adversely affect. So it's not a question of on the balance of doubt or something along those lines. It needs that much more rigorous level of certainty. And where doubt remains as to the absence of adverse effects, the competent authority will have to refuse authorization. So again, that sets out that sort of high bar quite well. Okay, so appropriate assessment, again, a phrase that's frequently bandied about and often in capitals, but really for me, appropriate is more of a descriptor. Appropriate really just means fit for purpose. There is no easy template which can deal with all appropriate assessments. It really means what is ever necessary to determine what the impacts of a proposal will be on a Natura site. And that's why there can be tiny little things. I've seen a paragraph or two, or I've seen vast tomes brought into the office on dollies and in trunks. So appropriate assessments can be all different shapes and sizes. Some of the best ones I've seen are actually some of the shortest ones. Conservation, again, objectives are crucial. Appropriate assessment is often a very narrowly focused piece of work. An EIA is much more holistic. It deals with noise and historic environment and this kind of thing. An appropriate assessment is simply dealing with impacts to Natura sites. To help you with that, existing surveys that can be really helpful, existing data sets, whether it's from consultancies who you might be involved with, SNH, RSPB, there are regional information centres. They can all be helpful sources of data. Sometimes new data is required, often for bigger kind of projects. That often needs extra time to be written into the program of work, because sometimes certain surveys can only happen at certain times of year, whether it's in the spring or over the winter months or whatever it may be. Important to note that you can't conclude no adverse effect on site integrity just because there isn't data. So you can't give it the benefit of the doubt. You need to have data, you need to have verifiable evidence that there is no effect, or no adverse effect, I should say. Okay, so I'm finally getting onto the conservation objectives. Crucial central element of HRA. They've got a legal status. You've already seen them written into the law itself, so they're explicitly referred to. They've been produced by SNH back in the day and agreed to by Scottish Government. I should flag up that there are new ones coming down the line relatively soon, for SACs at least, and these should flesh out what we mean by our conservation objectives a bit more. So I'll show you what conservation objectives at the moment look like. This is just a fairly simple single feature SAC. You can see at the bottom the species that it's designated for is Atlantic salmon, the River Bladnoch down in Dumfries and Galloway, and that text, all of it, not just the bullet points, are the conservation objectives. And the general idea is if you can keep to the bottom bullet pointed conservation objectives, you should generally meet that overarching text which appears at the top. So if you can keep to all the component parts, the overall integrity of the site is maintained. And as I've said, these will be fleshed out in these new, what we're calling conservation advice packages, or CAPs, which should be coming out soonish. But that's what they are at the moment. They're fairly generic, but you can see how you might try and use them as a yardstick. So you might be saying, okay, is what's being proposed going to change the, let's take the second bullet point, the distribution of the species within the site. So if you say someone's going to try and build a weir, a fairly spectacular weir across the River Bladnoch at some point, you might go, well, yeah, that might stop salmon getting upstream. So that could change the distribution of the species within the site. So that's how I think you should be trying to think about those conservation objectives. They're helpful yardsticks. Okay, certainty. I mentioned certainty and being convinced in an appropriate assessment. What does that actually mean? I mean, that's a nice idea to throw around, but okay, so how do you kind of explain that to people? And the Wednesday case kind of didn't come to the rescue exactly, but it certainly kind of helped to clarify what it meant. And there you can see it, the competent national authorities authorize such an activity, that's the plan or project, only if they have made certain it will not adversely affect the integrity of the site. That is the case where no reasonable scientific doubt remains. So again, a fairly high bar to pass. It's not on the balance of probability, it's where there's no reasonable scientific doubt. It doesn't say no doubt whatsoever, so you could have something that raises some small amount of doubt, but if the body of opinion decides there is no adverse effect on site integrity, then that's good enough. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, the burden of proof for that falls to the applicant, the proposer. As I said before, appropriate assessments are often not very complicated. They don't have to be vast tomes. Getting certainty is not always a difficult business. Depends on the nature of the project you're dealing with. However, it's probably worth saying, if you can meet those conservation objectives, those yardsticks, in 99% of cases, if you can meet the conservation objectives, you can conclude you've maintained site integrity. Okay, now there are limits to certainty, and this is quite a useful slide, I think, for planners in particular, because it was dealing with a planning-related case. It's from the Cairngorms funicular case back in the day. Some of you, slightly longer in the tooth, might remember that. And in that Scottish case, the judge in that case said there can never be an absolute guarantee, and absolutely correctly. But what you can do as a competent authority is to put in place a legally enforceable framework with a view to preventing the risks to the Natura site from the plan or project from materializing. So it's pretty much saying you can use legally binding conditions, caveats, and restrictions as mitigation to allow you to approve something, to give approval to a plan or project and for it to go ahead. And that's equally applicable to plans and projects. As planners, you know far more about planning conditions than I do. Okay, this is another phrase I bandied around an awful lot: integrity of the site. Again, quite a nebulous concept to people who aren't ecologists. Even to ecologists, I think this kind of raises some eyebrows at times. And I've given you a quote. I don't expect anyone to remember exactly what this means, but hopefully what you're getting out of that phrase is the concept of wholeness and of everything kind of working properly together in a sort of ecological sense. So integrity is more than just looking good. Something doesn't have to be an absolute wreck to have lost its integrity. To lose its integrity, for instance, a car could look like this, mostly okay, but with a fairly jarring bit missing. But a car that also doesn't have integrity could also look like this, because on the outside it might look absolutely fine, but it could have dodgy seat belts, it could have the wrong fuel in the fuel tank, it could have a broken back seat, dodgy indicator, bad gearbox. So although it looks okay on the outside, it might still have something wrong going on functionally within it. So integrity can be a complicated business, and that's again probably why it's worth talking to somebody like SNH to get advice when you come to the appropriate assessments. So it's all about does something work properly, not just does something look okay. Of course, it's a difficult scientific judgment to make. It depends on factors which will vary from case to case. Even cases which look very similar on the surface can have marked differences when you sort of dig into them a little bit. And again, just as with the screening stage, it's really important that the rationale behind why you think what you think is always recorded. It doesn't have to be a vast saga, but it needs to have something which says, we thought this because of this, and this perhaps. And if you do that, you're a long way to defending your position. Okay, so a kind of a bit of a summary slide again. Points to remember, and this is for both plans and projects, despite the blue text. Even if you decide there's a likely significant effect, it's perfectly possible for the appropriate assessment to kind of conclude, yeah, but despite that, there's no problem with site integrity, so we can approve it. So sometimes people think they have to push that harder than it really needs to be. Mitigation is often required. So again, planning with planning conditions and caveats of different sorts can always be employed to allow something to go ahead that otherwise couldn't. Remember that phrase about putting in place a legally enforceable framework. Again, useful for planners. And again, a cumulative aspect may need to be taken into consideration. If you're dealing with something pretty big and meaty like the Queensferry crossing back in the day, something like that, it's quite likely that something else might be happening around the Firth of Forth and having impact on a similar Natura site. So it's, again, sort of a flag to wave at you when it comes to something, often the more major projects, where there may be cumulative impacts. I mentioned mitigation a few times. Mitigation is worth just exploring a little bit again, because again, it's a bit more restricted and precautionary in its approach than sort of other environmental assessment processes. Mitigation, it needs to be made clear, because as I've made in my first point, only mitigation can be used in an appropriate assessment. You can't use what might be termed compensation. So the mitigation is there to give the competent authority that high level of confidence that something can go ahead while avoiding impacts on the Natura site. Compensation is quite different. Compensation can only be used in the derogation process for HRA, and this is what this slide is about. This is where you've got to the end of your appropriate assessment, and you can't say there's no adverse effect on site integrity. You've still got some kind of impacts going on, but you still want something to be approved. You want to give consent to it. And if that's the case, and this should happen very rarely, it's only happened a couple of times in Scotland so far, although there are more cases in the pipeline perhaps, so it's worth flagging up to you briefly. But if you want to approve something, there's a couple of tests you've got to satisfy. You've got to show there's no alternative solutions. There's no other way of doing something which would have a lesser effect on a Natura site. And if you can show that that is the case, you must then show, while there are also imperative reasons of overriding public interest, and that's the acronym for EROPI, sorry. And if you can show that there are those reasons, then you can then still give consent to that project. As you might imagine, having given what we've said so far, there's a pretty high bar set to that, and run-of-the-mill for housing applications or something like that probably don't meet that test. It would need to be something fairly important that provides a lot of public good and it's probably of a fairly major scale. And in that case, that's when you can use compensation to offset the damage that is now being done to the Natura site. So that's the big difference between mitigation and compensation. Mitigation is about minimizing, reducing, cancelling effects, and compensation is going, okay, we've had an effect, let's do something to try and make that good. Okay, the planning system Natura sites. I thought kind of a useful summary is probably good given the audience I probably have today. So the first point, generally speaking, there's a presumption in favour of development, is my understanding of the planning system, and development can generally go ahead unless material considerations dictate otherwise. And there's a whole bunch of things which are and aren't material considerations. I think quite a lot of debate about that at times. So the HRA process really sort of flips that to some extent. It says you cannot let this plan or project go ahead unless you can prove it won't have an effect. So it's a kind of presumption against development unless you can show that it meets the HRA test. So it has the potential to be a showstopper, which is the reason we're all here today. It's up to the applicants and the developers to prove that a proposal can go ahead. Now, having sort of flogged everybody with the rigor and the robustness of the HRA process, I think it's useful for me to try and point out, as probably a good SNH worker probably has to, that there are benefits of a good HRA. If you start an HRA early, given its potential to be a showstopper in certain circumstances, starting early and doing a good job of it can avoid quite a lot of unnecessary or abortive and even expensive work. If everyone can get on the same page as to what is needed to be done and what data needs to be acquired in order to help us come to the right kind of conclusion, the less sort of time and money is wasted amongst departments, businesses, etc. Excuse me. Doing an HRA, it's a really good way of demonstrating your compliance with the law and compliance with sort of more nebulous concepts like sustainability and that kind of thing. I've had councils, someone like the Cairngorms Council, a good indication in case, who were taken to court back in 2012 over their local development plan. And I don't know about before that time because I wasn't involved, but after that time, certainly they've been really robust in the way they do their HRAs for their plans especially. And although they say, yes, you know, it's a lot of work at the time, the benefits they get by showing community groups and other interested parties that their plan has gone through this rigorous process and come out the other end, and SNH has agreed with it and everyone's kind of happy, that it's a really useful thing to have done. Their decisions become less challengeable, and as we probably all know, more and more people understand their abilities to try and challenge different kinds of plans and projects, and so they can kind of try and use the HRA as their mechanism in to do that. So having a good, robust HRA is a really useful thing to have. A good HRA, especially say for a local development plan, or if you come around to doing one of those regional plans, which has been flagged up recently, they're a really good foundation for subsequent HRAs in your patch, in your part of the world, because it should have examined the kinds of impacts which are likely to happen to the Natura sites you have in your area, whether it's the River Bladnoch or the River Tweed or the River Spey or whatever it might be. And there's quite a lot you can often take from that for later subsequent HRAs dealing with a particular project near to the River Tweed or near to the River Bladnoch, or whatever it may be. So there's kind of a good foundational basis for doing them as well. And finally, I would say that coming from the angle of sustainable economic development, protecting Natura sites is one of the very best ways, again, that an organisation like a council can actually really practically demonstrate that they are actually undertaking sustainable economic development, not just economic development, by protecting those very important, the sort of most highly designated sites that we've got. And if you protect those properly, you can kind of claim to people, look, you know, we are making sure we undertake sustainable economic development. So that's my run through. A couple of minutes over time, but not too bad, I don't think. And I think now I'll probably turn this over to Trevor, perhaps to moderate, and Christian to help moderate the questions that people may have. I know we had a few that came in a couple of days ago from people, so we'll maybe start with those, but if you If something I've said has sort of flagged up something I haven't addressed fully, or has left you with more question and answers, then type your question in and we'll try and answer it before 3 o'clock if we can. And if it's something we can't answer, we'll take away and get back to it at some later date.
Thanks, Crispin. As you just said, if anyone's got any questions that weren't answered throughout the presentation, just please type them into the box. We will pick them up either just now if we can get through the ones we have, or afterwards. Just bringing up the first question. I don't know if the presenters want to bring their screens live as well. We are all still here. The first question we have in advance was someone looking for advice on habitat surveys with COVID restrictions on site visits in place at the moment.
Yeah, so non-surprisingly, it's something which is kind of evolving currently. Overarching is just very much do what Scottish Government say. On our website, on the SNH website, there is kind of specific page which has been set up, which is kind of explaining how we are dealing with coronavirus. So I would advise anybody to go to our website, because there is a whole page for planning development services, which has a lot of the information on it. Just today, there was a video by one of our directors about how we are now kind of moving as an organisation to be allowed to go back out and carry out site visits and whatnot. So that page will be updated really soon. From kind of my own personal experience, kind of work within the licensing team, I'm aware that some consultants have been continuing to work throughout and are working now. Obviously, a lot of that work does lend itself very well to lone working and social kind of distancing. So there's a good chance quite a lot of survey work still could carry on. And I think the other thing would be just that as an organisation, we do obviously recognise that there can be quite significant impacts from this kind of lost time, and when people can't do surveys or haven't been able to do surveys. And so we would encourage, and we ourselves be looking to be as pragmatic as possible when people are coming to us with the issues that this has caused. But all of that has to be taken into consideration with what Crispin's just been talking about that very high bar of us having to be convinced when it comes to these Natura cases, and that's what the law kind of says. But that's not to say that we will not try to be pragmatic and open to conversation around it.
Thanks, Christian. The second question we've got is in regard to Brexit. Could Brexit reduce the international status and oversight of Natura designations?
So Brexit, confusing as ever. There's no indications from Scottish Government that the regulations are going to change post-Brexit. Obviously, the requirement for the European protected sites and the need to carry out the HRAs of plans and projects has come from the EU directives, but they have now been transposed into domestic law. They were a long time ago, and that will remain in place regardless of what kind of exit we have from the EU at the end of the year. The domestic regulations, so the Habitats Regulations that Crispin's been referring to throughout that kind of talk, they will still be in place. And on top of those, so really what we'll be losing is that oversight from the ECJ. But there will be a move to create a oversight body within Scotland, which will be independent, and people can take grievances to if they feel that people are not complying with the environmental law. Likewise, there's one being set up in the UK, not including Scotland. That one's a bit further ahead. So we shouldn't lose the oversight, and the Natura sites will continue to be, albeit referred to as European sites, still be protected. The international status, not really too sure. I mean, I think, and Crispin might know more about this one, I don't know, but the European sites are also under other designations, possibly the Emerald Network, some of them, and Ramsar. So they still kind of are covered in the international sense as well. So we're really hoping that no great reduction in kind of international standing either.
Yeah, for practitioners, certainly the HRA process won't change anytime soon. The law is the law, and there's a much bigger fish to fry in Brexit than worrying about an environmental assessment process. In the long term, who's to say? You know, we didn't know what was going to happen to us all 6 months ago, really. But certainly, you know, in a practical sense, for people doing HRAs, the HRA process will continue. The sort of behind the scenes stuff about what badge will be designated by and what governance will oversee it and stuff like that. It's kind of useful to know, but for a practitioner like an SNH officer or a planner, then just knowing the HRA process is going to continue as it is probably, you know, the meat and two veg of what we're kind of talking about here, I think.
Okay, I'll just move on to the next question just now. There's a question regarding the stages of required consultation with SNH, and is it required on completion of and before adoption of the appropriate assessment?
Yeah, so for this one, in its simplest, legally the appropriate assessment can't be adopted until SNH have been consulted and given reasonable time to respond. I guess that's the short answer. Once again, reiterating what kind of Crispin's been talking about, as soon as it becomes clear that a plan or project is likely to have a significant effect on an Natura site, and so the HRA process is going to continue, notifying SNH as early on as possible will really make sure that there's no hold-ups, and we're able to, on our side, start getting in contact with you know, relevant area officers, Natura casework people, or you know, species and habitats advisors, and allow us to then provide advice to competent authorities as quickly as possible.
Okay, next question I've got here. Where there are two competent authorities, i.e. a local planning authority and Marine Scotland for intertidal developments, how should the HRA and appropriate assessment be split?
Yeah, so in situations such as these, like, there aren't set rules over who should be carrying out the HRA or the AA. All competent authorities are legally obliged to carry out a HRA. And so, you know, if there's no joined up working, then both competent authorities will be legally required to carry out a HRA. To reduce the amount of work on behalf of like both the applicant and the competent authorities involved, we definitely encourage that there's kind of cooperation between competent authorities in a situation like that, and that they work together to see who might be best placed to either carry out the entirety of the HRA with input from the other competent authority, or to kind of like split various parts of it and then work together towards one document, as long as it is covering what both competent authorities need to be taken into consideration.
Yeah, pragmatism and early talking together are kind of the keys there, I think.
Okay, and just tied to that, there was someone looking for an update on the people versus wind case from last year that you mentioned during the slides.
Yeah, so I'm right saying that they were kind of just looking for any of the kind of cases of interest similar to that, and sticking with that kind of theme of multiple competent authorities. There's a case from 2019 in England, which is Preston R versus Cumbria County Council, and lots of people have written about that. So if you Google it, you can read more in depth. But really, what that was saying, that court case, was that one competent authority cannot rely on the HRA and AA appropriate assessment carried out by another as a way to avoid the need to complete the process themselves, which hopefully doesn't sound contradictory to what I've just said. This was an example where one competent authority did not carry out a HRA because they felt that another competent authority had already done it, and therefore they didn't have to look at it. But that competent authority were only doing a HRA of a very certain part of the project, and so it didn't cover everything, and therefore they can't just rely and say, well, you know, it's their job to have done that, therefore we don't have to do it. It's kind of reiterating that all competent authorities are legally obliged to have carried out a HRA. You can work together to do it, but you certainly can't just say, well, they've said it's okay, therefore it must be okay.
Yeah.
I think that's the long and short of that.
Yeah, there's more rigor involved than that. Again, it's just one of those things. It's the nature of HRA really compared to something else.
Okay, thank you. I'll just take some questions from the chat room just now. There's someone looking for some clarification on minor residual effects and how to deal with them in regard to HRA.
Okay, that's a good question, and I will think carefully about how to answer it as succinctly as possible. Minor residual effects are those effects which aren't at the level of let's say the likely significant effect is this level. A minor residual effect might be at this level, so a smaller effect. But if you have 3 or 4 of those, they can together produce a likely significant effect. If they produce a likely significant effect, then that now needs to be checked. So you need to check if your minor residual effect from your project with the minor residual effect on that other project that happened or is happening over here, and check them together. That's what a minor residual effect is. So if you don't have any minor residual effects, there's no need to do an in-combination assessment, sort of screening, sorry. Again, it's a very short, bit simplistic. There's more on it. I can always take that away and talk to somebody a bit more detail if they've got a particular issue about a particular project. I don't mind being put in contact with this person if they need to.
Okay, as we said at the start, any questions we can't answer in full right now, we'll pass on to the SNH staff here, and we can try and get back at a later date. The second question I've got from the chat room is on cumulative impact. And does it have to be another plan or project you consider as part of your assessment of potential cumulative effects, or does anything that could be impacting on that site, the example is agricultural runoff, need to be considered?
Yeah, in your HRA, you're consenting what you're doing, but if there are other impacts that you know about that are happening to a particular Natura site, if it's agricultural runoff or a certain level of disturbance, or a pipe producing point pollution, something like that, then that should be taken into account in your HRA because that's an additional effect on the site. And that gets very hard to do because often these things aren't very well monitored or understood or categorized, or don't have a lot of survey or monitoring data applied to it. But if you have it, then you should be trying to take that into account in your HRA as well. Yeah.
Okay. I just did a kind of update on the minor residual effects question. Bob, is it at what stage are they identified? Is it at screening or appropriate assessment? And are they only used with the combination effects?
Okay. It's requirement in the legislation to do an in-combination screening at the LSC or screening stage. That's actually written into the law. I think I showed that before. Alone or in combination is the phrase that's used. It's not written into the law at the appropriate assessment stage, but there has been case law, again, from Europe, which said that it would be a bit odd if you didn't actually start doing something of an cumulative assessment at the appropriate assessment stage if needed. So it's required at both stages, but it's a bit awkward because it's only clearly written into the law at the screening stage. But case law has said you should do it at the appropriate assessment stage as well.
Thank you, Chris. I've got another question here. Someone mentioned it's good to see the emphasis given to the fact that appropriate assessment is a consenting process. And do you think the competent authorities, particularly planning authorities, fully understand this?
I don't know if anybody really understands it that well. It's kept me in a job for 10 years, probably. Certain aspects are understood better than other aspects. Yeah, that's probably about all I can say. I can't sort of pick out every different kind of planning authority and say this or that or the other because I'm not that familiar. But yeah, it's a struggle, and it's a struggle whether you're familiar with EIA and SEA or you're not familiar with those things. It can be almost worse if you're familiar with EIA and SEA, because you're very used to dealing with significant meaning a certain thing and likely meaning a certain thing, and then you have to get to quite a different headspace and think of it in a very different way. So yeah, it's difficult. Even people within SNH, struggle with HRA. And we in SNH, HRA training has doubled, and it's one of the few bits of training which has increased in SNH in the 10 years I've been there. A lot of training has actually kind of gone by the wayside or been reduced, but Natura training has increased because, we realise there's a sort of issue there over time.
Okay, thanks, Crispin. That was a particularly difficult question given our audience today. The next one I have is, are there any means of appeal or arbitration if a local authority thinks that SNH is being excessive in its demands or conclusions?
Officially, no. Unofficially, I'm sure there would be ways to sort of get that message across. However, you can always get individuals who maybe don't follow the proper processes wherever we work. But our guidance, and if things were kind of push came to shove, we would follow what we understood to be the most up-to-date case law and the best interpretation of case law that we can possibly follow. So, I mean, again, since even before my day doing Natura, I mean, one of the first things my manager said to me is that, our approach often isn't understood by other people because they don't quite grasp sometimes the rigor that's involved in the HRA process. So it is rigorous. It is a bit of you need to be in a different place to really understand it, sort of different headspace. But if we are being over vigorous in the way we do it, then absolutely. I mean, I would come back and point to why you think what you think again, why you think we're being too officious or too pernickety or too pedantic or whatever it is. I mean, I don't have a problem with that at all. I think, in fact, that's a really healthy kind of thing to do.
Okay, thank you. I can see we're coming to the end of our allotted time here, so I might have to make this the final question of the day. It is, supporting habitat can be problematic in that it may be some distance from the site. Someone's looking for where officers can get help or advice on this. Yeah,
it does get complicated. I don't have the time or the slides to help explain everything in real detail again in this, but yeah, supporting habitat, especially if it's outside, this is often to do with SPAs and birds who will forage sometimes, some distance away from the SPA. And if that's the case, the impacts to those areas outside the site are often, I'm kind of paraphrasing here, are often thought to be of a sort of lesser degree of severity than impacts that are happening within the site. They're not of no consequence, but in a general, I say paraphrase kind of sense, they can be of lesser impact. So if all your impacts are happening to some foraging area which is 10 kilometers away from the SPA, that's probably not as big a deal. And again, I'm sort of using sort of loose language, but not as big a deal as if you were disturbing those birds off one of their high tide roosts, for instance, because there are often a lot more foraging areas in the vicinity for them to use, and there's probably only 2 or 3 areas that can have used the high tide roost. So that, in a practical sense, is often why that's the case. But it is the case, but not, again, every case should be taken on its own merits. Sometimes only disturbing foraging area, if it's really important and there's very little of it, that's still very important. But if there's vast amounts of sort of agricultural fields that geese can feed in, it's probably of lesser importance.
Okay, thank you very much, Crispin. Unfortunately, we've just coming to the end of our allotted time. Thanks again to Crispin and Christian for the time today. Hope everyone that managed to tune in found it useful. Just a few bits of housekeeping before we go. As I said at the start, content from today will be made available. I will be sending an email out probably at the beginning of next week with a link to the webinar recording, a PDF of the slides, notes of the guidance that have been mentioned, and some contact details. In addition, I will pass on all the questions that have been asked today to Crispin and Christian. It'd be really appreciated if you could take a couple of minutes to answer a couple of very short questions at the end of the webinar when you log out. And if you do have any additional questions that you've not already asked, just please note them there as well. I'll collect all these and pass them on. and that is just coming to the end of our day today. And thank you all very much again. I can just ask my presenters to stay on the line and say goodbye to all our attendees. Thank you.